Good morning, everybody. Well, we're coming to the end of our Can I Get a Witness series based out of Luke 4 and Jesus' kind of mission of vocation. And I've been really enjoying it, and I've actually gotten a lot out of it. And by that I mean Jared's talks, not mine, because that would be incredibly narcissistic otherwise. If you turn with me to Luke 4, and we're just going to open up with the words of Jesus, because that's a great place to begin and to remind us of everything. What I want to do this morning is to read the passage that we've been basing ourselves out for the last 4 weeks, and then to kind of explore a little bit around that passage, and then to kind of introduce our character for this week. We've been following, for those of you who haven't been here, we've been following kind of a historical character each week to highlight, not to put them on a pedestal and say, this is what we should all be like, you should definitely be doing better, but to say, this is someone who simply persevered with their vocation in Christ, someone who, despite all of the things they came up against, despite all of the oppression, the suffering, and the persecution, just kept on going. And that's really what makes all of these people stand out. It's not because they possessed any qualities that were supernaturally greater than anything we possess, but that they simply refused to stop following God, even when it got incredibly difficult. So we're going to introduce a new character for today who I'm very excited and privileged to be able to talk about. But first we'll base ourselves in Galilee with Jesus. It says Jesus, in Luke 4, starting in verse 14, it says, Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and news about him spread throughout the whole countryside. He was teaching in the synagogues, and everyone praised him. He went to Nazareth, where he'd been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up to read. The scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, and this is where it gets awesome. He said, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he's anointed me to proclaim good news for the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. It's kind of like, boom. And that's the moment where he said, it's all been fulfilled, and they get a little bit cross. But here we find an insight into really the mission and the vocation of our Saviour. And the whole premise of what we've been talking about for the last 4 weeks is really that if we're to discover our call, if we're to discover our vocation, if we're to answer those sort of inevitable questions about our own life when we get overrun with the idea of what is my purpose, who am I, what am I here for, what am I supposed to do, I guess the premise is that we find all of that in this. We find everything that we are and everything that we are called to become in the reality of who Christ was and who he became in his ministry and all the things that he did. And so if we're trying to ask questions around our purpose, we go back to Christ and ask what was his purpose. And we find it in this moment where he began to unroll the whole ideology essentially behind his ministry. He said, I've come here essentially to liberate. And that then becomes your responsibility. And that's the process that we're going through. But I find that the structure of the entire chapter of Luke chapter 4 really, really interesting. So I just wanted to start there and use that as a bit of a launching pad. Because directly before that passage, we have Jesus kind of unraveling everything, and everyone's listening going, oh man, something definitely is about to happen. But before that, he spends a fairly significant time in the wilderness, kind of just wandering around praying. You know those times of when you find that solitary kind of place where you're just by yourself? I mean, some of us, maybe we're extroverts and we hate that space, and it really challenges us to be alone and by ourselves. Some of us are introverts and we love it and we just kind of crave it and oftentimes like really spend a lot of time looking for it. But wherever you fit on the spectrum, it's oftentimes really beautiful to come face to face with yourself in those moments of complete solitude, where you just invite God to be someone who can begin to shape and form and transform. A lot of the time, I think life is overwhelmed with voices and noises and people speaking to you and about you. And you know, you've got your job and you've got your life and your family, and it can be an incredibly chaotic kind of experience. And so to sit back and just breathe by yourself is a beautiful moment. And there's a lot going on in the wilderness when Jesus spends 40 days there being tempted by Satan and overcoming and doing that stuff. But that was a moment of profound preparation. So I think we've got slides. If you can flick up the next slide, we're just going to see the sort of the structure of the chapter. We've got Jesus' vocation being revealed. Before that, we've got Jesus in the wilderness. He's spending his time there in preparation. And it becomes really clear when you read the wilderness wanderings and what Jesus is preparing for. Whenever I read it, I get those, you know, those sort of tom beats in your head, like boom, 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 like something's coming. I'm like, this is cool. And then when he reads this, I'm like, oh, Now we know what he's come for. And it's great, but it's not that kind of Disney moment where he reads it and goes, I'm here to liberate everybody, because afterwards, if you just put up the net, click it again, that's the wilderness, and then click it again, we have this I put an awkward stoning attempt. So he reads this and he said, I've come to proclaim good news, which is like, okay, that's good. What's the good news? Okay, freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight to the blind, setting the oppressed free. And he's saying, this is all what God wants me to do. And so then they obviously chuck rocks at his face, because that's what you do when someone says this, right? It's this unusual kind of experience. He spent so long preparing for it, and he reveals that he's about to enter into this ministry of liberating people from captivity, from oppression, from suffering. And the response from the religious leaders is to get him out, because he's basically taking on the role of the Messiah and saying he's here. But he's not just here to overthrow the empire. He's not here to come in this kind of military conquest. What he's actually here to do is to liberate those that have actually been oppressed. Maybe even they've been oppressed at the hands of the ones who should have been liberating them the whole time. But that's another story. And then we finish with these beautiful narratives of exorcisms and healing. And that's, I mean, it's kind of weird for some of you maybe to hear those kind of stories where people are just blind and then suddenly they see, and people are demon-possessed and suddenly they're not. And it's kind of crazy. But you can see the transition from preparation to revelation to dodging a stone to, well, it's actually beginning to happen. And Luke introduces this as the beginning of the gospel that is it's just riddled with these moments where Jesus will reveal himself in glory, and that glory is expressed as liberation, as revealing of sight, of people being freed from demonic possession. And funnily enough, the response is not always, oh, that's so great. It's so great to see people being liberated. The response oftentimes is this kind of tension that begins to erupt in the narrative. And so that's one of the things that I think is oftentimes, it's important for us to acknowledge. I think we've said it kind of the last 3 weeks in a row, is that the moment we actually begin to find our vocation wrapped up in the vocation of Christ, it's not a story of Disney, really. I don't know how else to describe it. It's not. And I shared a couple of weeks ago how I was taught to tell my story in a way that made people feel like it was all going to be okay. Because I understand, like, we want it to be okay. But it's just oftentimes not. And I think the person we're going to talk about this morning will highlight that more than anything. That oftentimes when you actually take a step out and take a step forward and decide to find your call within the greater call and narrative of the gospel, it becomes a very turbulent experience a lot of the time. Because you're forced to come face to face with people, like we pray every week, who don't look like us, don't act like us, and sometimes don't even like us. But they don't always respond in the civilized manner that we want them to. We just want them to go, okay, I agree to disagree. Oftentimes that does happen. But a lot of the time it gets a little bit more challenging, and people begin to actually push back. And do you know how you're going to respond if people actually begin to push back? If you come with good news, that's not just good news for you, but good news for everybody. And people say, no, actually, we can't let these guys in. What about these? What about this point in this person's life? Do you know his history? Do you know who he's married to? Do you know where he's come from? Do you know what he does for a living? And we begin to label people and stereotype people. Do you know how to resist that and push back? And let's frame this and kind of journey through this pattern that we find in Luke 4 in the life of a guy called John Wesley. Some of you know old mate John, and I've loved getting to know John a little bit more. I'm not talking about myself, I'm talking about John Wesley. If you flick the slide, you'll be able to see his beautiful face right here. John Wesley, I studied a little bit about John Wesley when I was doing my undergraduate, and to be honest, I was just doing my degree, so I was like getting papers done as fast as I could. And I remember reading about him going, cool. And so we started this series. I thought, I'll get out my old sort of essays and I'll get some books and start reading about him. I can't explain to you the journey that I've been on the last few weeks just reading about this guy. And I think if I'm just reading about him, can you imagine living the kind of life that he actually lived? Here we have a man, and I think it's relatively unique in his life to have someone who is so committed to God and has such a passionate journey. And I've called it the journey inwards. He has this profound, transcendent journey with God where he travels into the innermost parts of his own soul and his own life. He has this almost unrelenting craving for more of God's presence, more of God's reality, more of God's grace and that kind of experience. And that that is a beautiful thing. But that's something I've heard a lot in my Christian experience. And to be honest, when I hear about people talking about that, I get a little, a little jaded. So I'm like, okay, I get it. Like, we can, we love God. Like, what's the natural, overflow from that? But here, you have a man who spent years journeying into the innermost parts of his own soul and life, desperately searching for an experience, an encounter with God. And when he had that experience, what began to erupt from that really defines him. But I think it would be a mistake to look at the outcome, the works of his life, without actually attributing it to that journey that first turned inwards. Because here we have a man who's basically been attributed with starting the evangelical movement, the Methodist movement, accidentally, also the Pentecostal movement. Like, there's a lot of stuff that began to erupt from his ministry and the things that he began to do. But first, he began to journey into his own soul and ask questions about who he was, and particularly who he was in relationship with God. When you read one of his first journals particularly, he attributes all of his theological development to one person. It's not Jesus, it's his mum, which I thought was kind of cute. The way that this man talks about theology is absolutely beautiful. I love theology, and I always thought I was unique because I'd have my most spiritual experiences with my head in a textbook, and I just love kind of learning more about what it was and how everything worked, and I just loved that process. But everyone else seemed to hate it, and that was okay. It made me feel special. But then I realized it wasn't because I was special. It's because people didn't really understand what it was to journey into understanding theology. People thought that theology was just trying to, mentally ascend onto a higher plane than everybody else so that you could win in debates. What John Wesley says is his faith is how you live your life, and theology is just how you articulate that life of faith. And it's a beautiful way of explaining that theology is simply the words that we use to describe what we believe and how we then begin to live that belief out. And all of it came from his mum. If you want a testament of how strong a person his mother was, I think she had 15 children. Yeah, I know, crazy. And she not all of them survived, but she raised them all up, and she was the one who taught them in the faith. And you think John Wesley, at times in his life, he had this kind of tenacity about him, this ferocity, that once he had something in his mind, he refused to let it go, and he refused to let people say no. He was an Anglican clergyman, but he oftentimes did most of his work outside of the church, simply because he couldn't find out how to actually engage in the kind of social action that he needed to within the kind of the constructs of what they'd built. But there's this moment in his very early life, I think he's like 4 or 5, when his mother, they're all sat in church, and you have the rector, the person who's doing the sermon, and she listens to the sermon and goes, you know what, I've had enough of this. So what she does is she starts a Sunday night service where she teaches her children what she thinks is appropriate, which for a woman back in these days was relatively, you had to be pretty strong. And so the priest came, decided that it wasn't for him and that she was doing something wrong, wrote to her husband who was on the road, who was an itinerant sort of minister, and said, you got to shut your wife up, basically. She's stealing all my congregants, because they had about 200 people at one point on a Sunday night. So he wrote to his wife, John Wesley's dad, and said, look, you got to stop. like you're upsetting the priest. And so she wrote back and said, fine, I'm an obliging wife. I will stop. But then you have to come back and teach him, because what he's teaching is absolute garbage. And so she had this kind of tenacity about her where she just refused. She knew what it was about, and she refused to teach them something that wasn't going to fill them with this sense of faith that wasn't just personal but was actually meaningful. So consequently, John Wesley grew up with this very strict and very methodical way of perceiving faith. And we oftentimes think of that, especially those of us with charismatic backgrounds, we think of that as really restrictive and really bad. But I think it's really great. It's a beautiful discipline. Phil mentioned spiritual disciplines before. The art of being able to pray and to read and to meditate and to being committed to this. And John Wesley grew up, essentially, and out of him came this idea of the holiness movement. So this kind of commitment to authentic Christian practice, authentic Christian discipline, to be committed to prayer, to be committed to fasting, to be committed to reading in a very methodical way. The overflow in the Methodist movement came out of that word, methodical, that kind of very strict, but not strict in a bad way, strict in a, hey, this is This is the way we do things. This is how we structure. There is a process. There's a tradition. There's things that we must do. And these things don't earn us grace and salvation, but these things keep us there. They keep us in that space with God. And so John Wesley, at the age of, I think it was 6 or 7, his house burnt down with everyone inside. They all were sleeping, and they woke up with sort of fire coming up on the roof and everything. They all managed to survive, and they all gathered outside. They gathered outside. They did a head count, and that would have taken a while. But then they realized John wasn't there. So they all rushed up to the house, and John, he just managed to climb out of a window. And he literally climbed out of the window into his father's arms at just the right time. And that was the moment when he realized that he'd been plucked out of that house and that his life was dedicated to God. And there was a very special place for him in the world. And that was the moment that he realized, there's something that I need to do in the world. That was in a sense, his sense of vocation. He thought, I have to, there's something, and we've all been there. We know that we're supposed to do something, but for the life of us, we can't think about what it is. We can't find what it actually is. We can't find our place. So we do lots of different things until we find the thing that speaks to our soul. And so he entered the ministry. He became an Anglican clergyman. He sort of grew up in that tradition. And he had, we can't spend time going through all of his life, but he had just a beautiful journey. During college, him and his brother Charles, his brother actually started the club. And it was basically like a Christian discipline club. Yeah, you've had those, right? Where you gathered together and you excelled in the disciplines. You'd pray and you'd fast and you'd read the scriptures and you'd meditate and you'd figure out what it all meant together. And they were called the Holy Club. It's like original, right? But I was reading about it was what they used to call them as an insult, like the Holy Club, because they were so holy. And out of that began the various societies that he began to start and plant, because such was his value on these authentic spiritual practices. But there was something inside of his soul, something inside of his heart, that whilst he was very methodical, it's very structured, always craving that kind of discipline, he had this yearning for something else, something deeper, something maybe that was missing, that was lacking. So he decided to go over to America, to the colonies, and to evangelize, because one thing that defines him more than anyone else is his passion for saving souls. He realized that the moment we enter into the faith, that our job then becomes to allow others to come in. But I think the way that he did that was particularly outstanding, because we've all seen the people that, with the billboards, that they have a similar mantle on their life, but it's more of a eternal burn kind of thing. Like, I'm going to preach, and if you don't respond, that's not really my problem, because you're going to be burning in the fires of hell for the rest of your life. So we're all good. That wasn't John. He had a passion to see people enter into the kind of faith that he'd experienced in his life. But he knew there was something he couldn't quite grasp. So he decided to go over to America. And on the way, in the boat, something really profound grabbed his soul, because there was a big storm. And if you've ever been on a boat with a storm, I remember my granddad had a boat once. Actually, he had a ship. It was cool. It was a ship. And we were in Malta. It was awesome. But then a storm came, and so we went to sit on the hull, because it was cool. But it was a violent storm took over John Wesley's ship. And all the Englishmen on the ship who were going to America were freaking out, like Englishmen do. Like, oh my goodness, what are we going to do? And then he finds this group, and he walks into this room, and there's this group of Moravian priests in there who come from a very pietist tradition, very kind of reflective, and so he walks into the room, and they're all singing hymns and just sort of meditating. And he walks in like, oh my gosh! And they're just going, mm-hmm. And he begins, after like everything's smashed and all, they get through the storm and everyone's freaking out. He asks them the question like, what, what on earth? How are you able to maintain such calm in the middle of such chaos? And one of them said to him, oh, we're not afraid to die. That's not what terrifies us. And he was overtaken with this sense of peace that had captured them, and that began to... And it's a nice story, and we think, oh, it's so great that he got to see it. But it drove him mad, because he couldn't get it. Have you ever tried that? Like, you see someone who's really holy, and you just try and, if I could just get it. I do it. Like with speakers, I look to see good speakers, and I'm like, oh, it's such a good speaker. But you're not like, wow, it's so cool. You're like, oh, I hate you. Let's be honest. And you're like, if I could just take that and be better than you. I'll confess later. But he looked to them, and it drove him mad, This idea that you could experience such grace and such peace and such kind of inner clarity, but that his soul was in such turbulence. Like he'd prayed, he'd fasted, he'd done everything he was supposed to do, but still, he just couldn't feel that. So he went to America, he preached, people came to God. It was beautiful. It didn't disqualify him from the community of faith, but there's always something restless. He ended up getting kicked out of America because he fell in love with someone who got married to someone else, and then he excluded them from church, and it was a big hoo-ha. And so naturally, that's always happens. And you have to come back to England. And he arrived back in England, but he began to find communities of Moravians, the people that he found on the boat who were so peaceful. And he started to get involved with them. He became friends with one in particular, him and his brother. And at a particular point, I think I'm skipping through slides here. You just have to kind of anticipate me. Could you, so on the 24th of May, 1738, he decided, and in his journal he writes this, I reluctantly went along to this Moravian meeting. It was his friend that had put it on. We've all been there as well. Come to this church event. You're like, probably should. Like, people will notice if I'm not there. But he went, and he had the experience that he'd been searching for years. And he just wrote, and these words, maybe some of you have heard them before, but these words carry so much meaning. He went into this meeting where they were praying and meditating, and he said that I felt my heart strangely warmed. And commentators that have written about John Wesley say that this was the moment of his conversion. This was the moment where he came to faith. He was preaching before that. He was seeing people come to faith. He was getting people into the church. But this was the moment where his soul was transformed. I wonder how many of us, I work at a Bible college, and so consequently I get to meet a lot of pastors and people planting churches and developing churches. And the amount of people who've talked to me about a conversion experience that they've had in the middle of pastoring churches is, it's terrifying in one sense, but it's also beautiful because the humility that it takes to come to a place where you've been doing something for your entire life, but then you have this conversion experience that completely reorients you is just a beautiful moment. So this was the moment where he experienced that grace, that peace, that kind of transcendent experience became suddenly close to his soul, and everything began to change. And it is a beautiful experience because from this, his passion for seeing people come into the church, come into Christ, realize who God was, it increased exponentially. It grew more than it ever could, but it wasn't just, I'm an evangelist, I need to get people in. It was I have experienced grace, and therefore I must preach grace, and people must experience grace. The way he talks about evangelism, if you click to the next slide, he says, when a man becomes a Christian, he becomes industrious, trustworthy, and prosperous. Now, if that man, when he gets all he can and saves all he can and does not give all that he can, I have more hope for Judas Iscariot than for that man. He says that if you experience that grace and that peace and that level of inner clarity and you hoard it to yourself, that's when everything goes wrong. And so here is where we begin to change the narrative a little bit. Because here's where the teaching that I grew up with ends. Search inwards. Faith is about your journey with God. Who can you become? What is God speaking to you? And those are all great, important, clarifying questions. But unfortunately, they're only the first half of the questions that need to be asked. Because what begins to happen now is the eruption of God's work that comes through him based on the journey that he has gone into his own soul, if that begins to make sense. It reminds me profoundly of one of my favorite theologians is called Miroslav Volf. It's just an awesome name. Volf. He was a Croatian guy. But his life is crazy. We'll maybe go into that another day. But he's got the same kind of turbulent upbringing. And I read a quote from him this morning. Just share it. This is totally off topic. He says, theology is not about understanding the world. Theology is about mending the world. And I loved it because he understands the same thing. There's a quote from him on the next slide. It says, Christ's indwelling presence has freed us from exclusive orientation towards ourselves. I love that. The fact that we actually can journey inwards to our own souls, but that Christ's experience actually liberates us from staying there. Because this is the trap. It's good to journey inwards. It's necessary. And that is the moment where Christ meets us in intangible and unexplainable ways. But if you stay there, it actually has the reverse effect. And it becomes negative. It becomes self-gratifying. It becomes this kind of inner, without any practical. And so he says we're freed from exclusive orientation towards ourselves and opened up in two directions. Firstly, towards God, to receive the good things in faith, and towards our neighbor to pass them on in love. And here's where we come face to face with John Wesley's ministry. So if we can flick again to the next slide. This is what he talks about when he talks about evangelism. He says, you have nothing to do but to save souls. You got nothing to do, literally. Nothing else. Therefore, spend and be spent in this work. And go not only to those that need you, but to those that need you most. It is not your business to preach so many times and to take care of this or that society, but to save as many souls as you can. Translated, there are a lot of trappings surrounding the ministry of Christ. And those of us who have been involved in ministry for any number of times realize that you can be doing all of the right things, but really not be doing the right things, if that makes any kind of sense. It's this great paradox that you could be working for Christ and his kingdom, but really not working for Christ and his kingdom. It looks good, it feels good, you can experience this sense of almost like an adrenaline high. Like, I've come to church, I've preached, it was awesome, like 3 people complimented me and no one threw anything at me and I feel so good about myself today, when actually nothing is really happening. And here, I was challenged. The first thing, you got nothing to do but save souls. And again, it's not the case of be saved, repent. It was this sense of experience God's grace. And let's create pathways to actually let that grace smack you in the face. And so he lived in England in a time of great social class divide, where the church, funnily enough, was this place for the elite, for the rich. And he particularly was within the Anglican church in the 18th century. So there was a lot of corruption there. You actually had to pay rent to sit on the pews. By the way, you're all overdue. But you had to pay rent. So consequently, if you were working in the fields, if you were working in the mines, if you had a low income, you couldn't afford to come to a church on a Sunday. This was sort of really close to the post-Reformation period. So Catholics were seen as, they were trying to get rid of all of that from England. And so these rise of these kind of elite churches arose. And John Wesley grew up within that. Grew up within that tradition. And that was I think I need to stand back. So it's not because of you. It's me. He grew up within that tradition, and he was like his father was in the ministry, he was in the ministry. But once he had this experience, he actually got invited to preach in the open air, because the moment he had that experience of grace and he started preaching grace, you know what everyone said to him? I think we're good. Like, we're okay. Like, we need people to be formed in the disciplines. We need people to feel a little bit of guilt, a little bit of shame, a little bit of manipulation, because that's how we keep everybody in line, right? It's actually the most effective way to organize ourselves. So they said, we're okay for now, thanks. So he was no longer allowed to preach. And so he got invited by this guy called George Whitefield to preach in the open air. And George Whitefield had a ministry preaching to thousands. And so, practically you'd think, score. And John Wesley's response was, how disgusting. That you would invite me to preach anywhere except to church, because the church is the only place that people can experience salvation, is exactly what he said. But reluctantly, because no one else wanted him, he went out and preached in the open air and described his experience as being, again, one of those most transcendent moments where people began to come up to him. And these were people who were working in the mines, working in the fields, people who currently didn't associate the fact that religion meant anything to them. Because if they can't afford to come into the building, clearly God can't have any kind of practical implication for my life. He's there for the elite. He's there for the wealthy. But he began to preach to these people as this kind of faith was erupting inside of his soul. And he began to see masses after masses come to him, lay down and commit their lives to Christ in just beautiful and transforming ways. And so he just began preaching wherever he could. He actually was renowned for preaching. If you look at photos like this one, he's actually preaching on his father's grave. I'm not 100% sure why. But he did it at least 3 times. But it looked like it was effective. People kept coming. Oh no, I do remember the story. He wasn't actually allowed in. They invited him to speak at the church, and when they got there, they said, "Oh, we've heard some bad stuff. Unfortunately, we're going to cancel service." And then he was like, "Sure." And he got outside. Hey, come, we're going to still have a service, but we're not inside, so it doesn't matter. Like these kind of things were just absolutely crazy. And so as he's going, he's forming little groups and little societies of people who are meeting together, still practicing that methodical spiritual discipline, but at the same time knowing that that intangible experience of peace and grace was exactly what should happen. But whenever they formed these societies, the natural eruption from it was that they would begin to engage in various different realms of social work and social engagement, bringing justice to the people that needed justice. Wherever they'd have a church building where they would actually meet together, in the evenings that church building would be a homeless shelter, and they'd always have these spaces. And the crazy thing is the amount of persecution they would experience for actually speaking to people that the church didn't speak to was insane. They'd have mobs from the Church of England coming and rioting at their gatherings. The first Methodist church that they actually built, they had no windows on the ground floor because they knew that they would get smashed and people would begin to break in. Like the actual persecution that began to come from the religious authorities because they were preaching to people. And the reason, I mean, there's a lot of reasons that it was painful, but people were experiencing salvation suddenly outside of the four walls of the church. So they weren't paying the money. They weren't doing the right things. And one of the greatest scandals is that John Wesley realized it wasn't just about him. He began to raise up lay preachers who weren't ordained by the church and say, look, if you can experience this grace, this peace, and communicate it, and other people will get it, go and preach. And so people began spreading all over the country, going overseas into America. They found like Methodist communities being started. Methodist simply springing from that kind of combining of peaceful, gracious experience as well as strong Christian discipline. And they became renowned for this experience of Christianity that was profoundly engaged with the social structures of the day, bringing social reform to prison communities. He was involved in the abolitionist movement as well in England. It was just the amount of things. But all of that came from that initial journey inwards. And that's really one of the things that I wanted to highlight this morning is just in the same way that in Luke chapter 4, Jesus goes into the wilderness to this place of preparation and gets this understanding, this revelation of what is about to happen. And then people start throwing rocks at him. And then throughout the rest of the gospel, people are just coming up against him. And there's scheme after scheme to hurt. This is Wesley's experience over and over again. But not only was he committed to saving souls and to kind of bringing people into this intangible experience and sending them out to do the good works that will begin to reform society. He had this incredible ability to just work with all different kinds of people. I mentioned before, the guy George Whitefield was this beautiful man like that invited him to speak, and they became really good friends. But funnily enough, they came from polar opposite spectrums of the theological persuasion. I don't know if you've ever experienced that with anybody. I never have. But you believe totally opposite things, and you're talking, thinking that you're on the same page, and then suddenly it's like, whoa, you're crazy. And so George Whitefield, for all intents and purposes, was a Calvinist who believed in predestination. I mean, there's only a few differences that they had, but the differences that they had were vehement differences. And they ended up splitting apart from each other because they couldn't agree on the things that they believed. And again, John Wesley had this intangible encounter with God that led to his gracious explosion. And George Whitefield was a little bit more kind of okay, you need to turn, otherwise, anyway, I don't want to diss him. But the beautiful thing about that relationship was they fell out numerous times. He records in his journal, it's quite funny. But they managed to find a way to come back together again. They always came back to this place. And I remember they wrote an article asking George Whitefield to slander John Wesley, basically, because they just had that moment where they'd fallen out and they'd fallen over this strange theological thing. And they asked George Whitefield the question, do you think John Wesley will be in heaven? Because that's what they were arguing about, how we get to heaven and will you get to heaven outside the church, all that sort of thing. Will you see John Wesley in heaven? And George Whitefield said, you know what, I don't think I will. Because I think he'll be so close to the throne that I won't be able to see him over everybody else. And I read that and I thought that the level of humility, what it's about is diversity, isn't it? It's about being able to commit. And this is the beautiful thing. This is kind of where we're going to finish and land is we get this experience. Maybe we're in the stage of preparation. Maybe we're starting to realize what's unfolding for us in terms of our vocation, our calling. Or maybe you're on the other side where you begin to hear people shouting at you, calling you names, saying things that are coming up against you. Maybe you're involved in the ministry of healing and exorcism in terms of seeing the work of God manifest on the earth, that theology that mends the world. Maybe you're involved in that. Wherever you are on the spectrum, we all differ. But what actually unites us is the fact that we can come together realizing that we all fit within that same vocation. We might disagree about certain little things, but we all fit within it. The last thing that I want to share with you, and really as a kind of a takeaway for all of us, is that John Wesley had this beautiful way of reading the scriptures. It became known as Wesley's quadrilateral, which is a really inspiring title. But the way that he taught us to read the scriptures was incredible. So let's just flick on to the next one. So we have the scriptures, and again, we have this, and we hold it, don't we? And we go, this is the word of God. And then we read it, and then we go, like, I know it's the word and everything, but there's something, it's hard to read, right? It's confusing. It's because we've abstracted it. We've taken it away from what actually embeds it in reality. Like Jesus, the word, the living word, the reality is what this points to. It's not something in and of itself. And so we often have in Christian languages, we have God, the Father, and then the Son, and then the Spirit, and then we have the Bible. And the Bible is this strange kind of thing that we just have to use to kind of, understand in some way. But the Bible points to Jesus all the time. That's the purpose of it. And I think Wesley understood this, and so he began teaching people how to read it. He said that Scripture, if you flick to the next one, must be read in the context of tradition. You cannot separate something as complicated, confusing as this from all of the minds who've ever read it before. From all of those people who've gathered together and met and gone, what does this mean? You can't take it out of the tradition of church history that actually allows us an insight. But not only tradition, the next heresy was that you have to combine it with this thing we call reason. Dangerous, right? Because that's us, the flesh. Reason is our ability to go, does that make sense? Have you ever read something in the Bible and gone, that doesn't make sense? It must just be God's plan. Like I was taught a class this week on Joshua and the conquest. You know that moment where God apparently says, go in and kill all of the men, all of the women, all of the children. And we go, oh, well, his ways. Right? You ever gone, I'm not cool with that. Like, what on earth? But we short-circuit our cognitive faculties because we think that it must be, well, actually he says, no, we actually bring that into it. When we read the Bible, that's exactly what's happening. We are reading the Bible. We're bringing ourselves into the text. But we're not coming in alone. We're coming in with tradition. We're coming in with understanding. We're coming in as a community. And therefore, the outworking of all of this, in the next slide, is the experience that comes from that. Because this was the heart of his life, was his profound experience with God. See, all of the other stuff, we've labored the last 3 weeks on really important issues of sort of social reform and social justice and all that. And that is essential and critical to the Christian experience. But what I wanted to do today was frame it all from the very beginning of how we begin to journey in. Because if you separate any one of these from the others, we begin to lose our way. And so what the Protestant church had done in England at the time of Wesley, they were trying to get rid of a lot of the tradition because that was seen as Catholic. And what a lot of people today do is they get rid of reason, right? Because that's our own fleshly self. And what a lot of people do is they say, well, I'll just take experience because that gives me that kind of self-gratification in the moment. The loud music, the pumping beats, the flashy lights, I put my hands up and, ooh, it's so good. And then you go home and wonder why you're still depressed and wonder why everything's still going wrong. And it's not making, well, it's making fun, but it's not to bring criticism on its own. It's to say that what if all of this became part of who we were as Christians? What if we were able to respect? I heard someone say recently as I was talking to them, they said, because Pentecostalism, that charismatic experience arose out of Wesley's movement, said, what if they just kept it? See, Pentecostalism is one of the fastest growing religions in the world. It's bucked the trends. The trends, there's a guy called Emil Durkheim, who's a philosopher who predicted the decline and the end of religion. That religion would fall to secularism. And I remember seeing a guy who presented a paper saying, you know what changed that trend? Was Pentecostalism, was experience. Was people being able to come into a church and not just learn about a book that was written thousands of years ago, but they could actually experience what came from it. But unfortunately, in a lot of cases, that experience is separated from reason, from tradition, from history. And so it becomes ungrounded and unsubstantiated. But because we live craving this kind of experience, which is not bad, but is not all of the conversation, like Wesley, he craved that experience. Because it becomes abstracted, we oftentimes lose our way. So what if you could begin to put experience back into tradition? And you could experience as well as use your brain to reason. That was always my problem. There's a short circuit here, so I couldn't lift my hands. I was like, it didn't work. What if they all worked together? And experience was the natural product of opening up this text and reading about that strange man who lived all of that time ago, who absolutely transforms everything that we do. That would then begin to, I think, liberate not just us, but liberate everyone who comes in contact with us. Not because of us, but because of God's work through us. And that's what the gospel is, I think. And I think Wesley, for better or worse, embodied the journey of us all in so many ways. And I think he offers us two promises. First of all is that promise of persecution when we actually begin to become liberated. There's another quote that I thought was too depressing to put on there. But he basically said, if you're not persecuted, you're probably not doing it right. Which, I guess I just said it now, didn't I? So, if no one starts clapping then. But the second thing that he promises us is that if we seek, we will find. Like if you search for God, you will find him. Because it's not the case that we're running after him, trying to catch up with him, and he's like, come on, keep up. It's at the moment we realize that we need to seek, we turn around and we run straight into the one who's been there all along, just waiting for us to orient ourselves. That's what happened to Wesley. And that, I don't know about you, but that's the conversion that I'm looking for every day. That's what I want to experience. You know, I go through those days where I think I've got it right. I'm like, sweet, I'm on the right track. And I go through those days when I seem to fall apart and everything's going wrong. And I imagine that would be the same for most of us. But let's begin to chase after an experience that really transforms us as we find our vocation in Christ's vocation, and be inspired by men like John Wesley, by men like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, by Sojourner Truth, and by the countless other people that we find in the pages of history. So the last little thing, I think we've got one more slide, is another picture of him. And going back to that quote, is that faith is a life that we live, and theology is the way that we articulate it. And using that understanding to show that every day we actually begin to live out the way that we know and experience God. And my question is what does our God look like, expressed in how we're acting now?